Collective Diaspora is a cooperative, a membership-based organization of Black cooperatives and Black-led organizations that are supporting cooperatives globally throughout the African diaspora in particular. Our focus is really being able to connect those cooperatives and organizations on the ground that, regardless of the country that we're operating in, and want connections to others that are also engaged in this work. So whether it's a cooperative of solar panel installers in Harlem, or it's a cooperative of artisanal miners in Colombia, or cocoa growers in Trinidad, we're creating spaces where we can come together, exchange information, and support each other in our work, in our development.
This week's guest is Omar Freilla, the co-founder and steering committee member of Collective Diaspora, a global community of Black cooperatives and Black-led cooperative support organizations. Omar is a serial trailblazer, social entrepreneur, and movement builder dedicated to community self-determination and regenerative economies. Drawing from his experiences growing up in the South Bronx of New York and witnessing struggles for community empowerment, he has dedicated himself to creating just and regenerative economic systems. Omar's time with the NYC Environmental Justice Alliance and Sustainable South Bronx inspired him to utilize cooperatives as a vehicle for transformative economic development. He also established Green Worker Cooperatives and launched the first ever worker cooperative business accelerator in the United States, pioneering innovative approaches to cooperative development. Additionally, Omar co-founded several local and national cooperative support organizations, including the US Federation of Worker Cooperatives, the Democracy at Work Institute, and the NYC Network of Worker Cooperatives. Omar is also an adjunct lecturer at the City College of New York and serves on the City of New York's Environmental Justice Advisory Board and is member of New York State's Just Transition Working Group. This interview really opened my eyes to the potential of new worker-led economic models for historically marginalized and economically exploited communities. It also has made me reevaluate the privileges I've experienced through life. Now, over to Omar. Welcome, Omar.
Thanks for having me, Mark. It's nice to be here.
Excellent. I've been looking forward to this. So, Omar, now that we've established what you do, let's start with the big questions, the big fundamental questions about you. Who are you? Who are you as a human being?
Yeah, well, I'm lots of things. I'm a parent, I'm a husband, I'm a member of a community. I'm someone who believes strongly that everybody has an innate knowledge and ability to govern their own lives, and we know what we need, and that we shouldn't get in the way of that. And so I'm someone who in the work that I do or that I've done, I center that. I center that there's beauty in people, in all things, and that what there is to be done is just to get out of the way and allow people and things to grow and become beautiful, and nurture that in the process.
It's a very lovely philosophy. That leads us nicely to the next question. Who or what made you the person you are with that belief system?
Well, lots of people and circumstances. I live in New York City, in the Bronx, in the South Bronx, and this is where I grew up and was raised. And both of my parents emigrated to New York from Dominican Republic, and it was my mother who raised me. She and I in our apartment in the Bronx. And I grew up during the 70s and 80s, a child of the 1970s and 80s and 90s. And, those are my formative years. And I grew up during the time that was really impactful for me. This was a time in the Bronx and in New York City where our community had really been decimated by decades of white flight, of manufacturing leaving the country, cities being abandoned by federal governments, being seen as places for second-class people. And so at the time that I grew up, New York City was being disinvested in the Bronx in particular, and other communities of color, primarily Black communities, Black and Black, including not just African Americans, but also folks from the Caribbean, where my family is from, who we'd been living in communities that were seen as places not worth investing in. And so the city of New York actually actively disinvested, used a strategy called planned shrinkage, where
I
communities
didn't know that.
where services would be cut. And so firehouses were cut, really necessary services were cut. This is, really emblematic of neoliberalism taking off. And so was that the Bronx became known as a place that was full of burning buildings. And it was seen as a place of burning buildings because buildings were actually being burned, but not by residents. They were being burned by landlords who were making an economic decision that they would get more money from insurance payments than on their property than they would on actual rental payments, because people just had less and less money. So this was something that happened all over the place.
Contextualize that in terms of the time, because a lot of people might not be aware that New York as a city was bankrupt in the 1970s. But obviously, the time period you're talking about must have come after that bankruptcy that led to certain decisions around social services being deprived in certain communities, like you're discussing the Bronx.
Absolutely.
That period, it was probably around the time of Reagan coming into power, and a lot of big changes happening, not just in New York, but nationally in the US, with radically different economic policy that was being pursued under the previous administration under Carter.
Yeah, not that different.
No?
Neoliberalism is still very much a driving force in the US economy and in cities because of organizing, and because of, folks on the left organizing and pushing back against it. It's much more difficult to move forward, and there's opposition to the practice of cutting services, to the practice of balancing the need for services on the backs of poor people instead of taxing companies that are earning profits. But that is still very much the driving force behind the US, whether it's at a local city level, state level, or federal level. And we still have, multinational corporations based in the US that get tax breaks that are well beyond what you or I, or an average person in the United States is getting.
It's funny, as you're saying that, I've had a conversation with another South Bronx resident and difference maker, Paul Lipson, who I believe you know. I'm interviewing Paul in a couple of weeks, and he was just talking about the impact and the negative externalities of companies like Amazon having massive warehousing in communities like the South Bronx, and the impact it has not just on the impact of the gig workers that it draws in, but the environmental impact of all those drivers and the bad air and the impact on children's health and asthma levels is shocking. And that's just one organization we're talking about. So yeah, that's good. So please go back to that point around this of the impact on you and what made you you, and that time period that had such an impact on your worldview.
I'll share a story, one moment that really stood out for me, that I look back and just take as a moment that really symbolizes the times and how I was feeling. 10 years old, standing in front of my apartment building on the corner of Townsend Avenue and East 174th Street, and on the corner of Townsend Avenue and right next to the Cross Bronx Expressway. And looking out over the Cross Bronx Expressway, my apartment building was right on the corner. Cross Bronx Expressway, I didn't know it at the time, but it was built. When it was built, it really decimated the Bronx, and it was one of the factors that really furthered the spiraling of the Bronx, and that led to landlords winding up burning their buildings for insurance payments. But I didn't know any of that. What I saw at 10 years old looking out were apartment buildings across the way on the other side of the highway, and nearby several that were abandoned. And in their windows, in place of windows, were silhouettes, paintings, images of silhouettes of people, of potted plants, so that if you actually drove by, you were on the highway and you're driving by, you wouldn't notice. But if you're actually standing there looking at it, what you see is a fake window. It's
Wow.
just something that painted that looks like there's a person there or a potted plant. And this was a practice for a few years in the 1980s that the city under Mayor Ed Koch decided to do as a way to invest money in the buildings just enough so that if you're commuting, driving on the Cross Bronx Expressway, you wouldn't notice that there were abandoned buildings there. And to me, at 10 years old, I remember looking out at that and thinking one thought: they don't care about us. That was the thought that I had then at 10 years old. And they being the city, predominantly white, and that's who is in city government, and us being my community, African American, Caribbean, Dominican, Puerto Rican, all of us who were there. And and so I completely felt left out and felt like, and thought to myself, why don't they, the city, invest money in actually fixing up the buildings, and allow people to actually live in them as opposed to just covering up, making them pretty for passersby. And this was really a symptom. This is the symptom. This is part of the question of who is it that is driving decision making? Who is a community for? Who are the institutions for? Who is the housing for? Who's actually getting to say what's present? This was happening in the 1980s, but at the same time, there were other people in the community who said that, this is not the way it should be, and in other places. And this is what I became drawn to over time. So people who have come together and said, and, in the Bronx, it was people coming together, taking over abandoned buildings, turning them into housing cooperatives, people taking over vacant lots, turning them into community gardens, basically people who are coming together in different places, organizing, creating some kind of collective ownership, management of resources, and in order to meet their own needs. And that, I didn't have a name for that then, but that is what cooperatives are. And that is what has attracted me to cooperatives as a form of development of communities, as a form of people coming together where there's engaging in collective action for self-determination. So that's been a big piece of that. And cooperatives, these are any institution, business that's collectively owned and managed by its members in order to meet their need. And you see them in all kinds, in all forms, in all places. But this was a driving piece. I wasn't aware of cooperatives then. What I was aware of was over time was community organizing. I was aware of people taking these kinds of actions. As a teenager, I fell in love with groups like the Young Lords Party and the Black Panther Party, and saw these as groups. I knew of people who were part of those organizations in New York City at the time, and saw them as ways where people were taking, militant collective action and really organizing to meet people's needs in the community with this framework that there is something that is not working in our current economic system, and that it's not working in the sense that it allows for people to live at the margins, whose needs aren't being met. The fact that there is inequality, we would call them, this is a market failure. The fact that people are going hungry, who have the capacity and the ability and the desire to get their needs met, and to be able to put food on the table. These are breakdowns, but they're intentional. They're allowed, I should say. It's just part of how things operate, and it's accepted. So that the example that you gave, using talking about these last mile facilities that are opening up in cities, without regard for the environmental impact on communities, we're seen as the casualties. It's allowed. that it's okay. It's for the purpose of having economic development, but that's not the only way that things need to go. And so that's something that it's been there for me for a long time. Is that, this is not the only way that there is, then what other ways are there? Let's create those ways.
Recounting that story, that memory of looking out onto those buildings and recognizing, coming to the conclusion that they don't care about us. That sense of the recognition of the social injustice and the economic injustice that was enveloping your community. Did you talk to your parent or your mother about that? Or what impact did that have on you? At what point did it go from just a recognition to actually saying, I need to do something about this? And how did it manifest itself in you in terms of you beginning to take some form of action or taking a direction in your life that has led you to where you are now?
That's a good question. I don't recall. Be honest, I don't recall at 10 years old recently my mother about.
It's such a vivid memory
Yeah,
to have that feeling at that age.
yeah. I wonder if I did, and what my mother's response was. I mean, my
Mm.
mother's the type of person, she didn't take any mess from
Yeah.
anyone. And so if we were, somewhere in some government office for whatever that she needed to fill out paperwork for, she was not one to just sit by and just be left waiting or, get the runaround. So
Her voice would be heard.
her voice would definitely be heard. So I don't know. I can make things up, but I'm not going to make things up here.
Yeah.
Yeah. But it's a good question. I'm going to have to, sleep on that one.
We spoke when we were first introduced, and should give a shout out to the delightful Mariana Koval that connected us. When we first spoke, you talked about this inclination for social justice and the recognition you had, obviously, at that early age, and that was the initial sort of seed that was planted inside you, that you recognized the challenges, that you talked about your desire to always take a practical approach to finding solutions to material needs. And I thought that was a lovely way of summing up action taking. A lot of people recognize and are impacted by social injustice and do nothing about it. What was it that made you become such an action taker and to embrace the power of self-determination that you talk about? Was it the impact of parents, grandparents, mentors, educators, teachers, or was it just something that was natural in you?
Sure. It's muddy. I have two children, they're 10 and 12. And as I've seen them grow over the years, that's a question that I started out very much, it's all nurture, but I don't know. My two kids are very different, but the circumstances change and at different points in time. They're 2 years apart. I'd say for me, to answer your question, for when I was a young person, you know, I'm present to the many people who had been a part of my life that go way beyond the stereotype of what people outside of my community, outside of any low income community of color would think is present in a community that was and still remains the poorest congressional district, that had, very little access to good quality food, where there was a high rate of crime, there were abandoned buildings. There were still it was very much present that there were people in my community within the few blocks, within around my school, in after school programs, people who have always been there. So I recall at an early age being able to go to my middle school, being a part of the marching band there and music programs that were there. I was a part, if there anything that was going on, I was a part of it. So I was a part of a outside of school music program as well. There was even, the cadets, which is, you know, I wouldn't have my kids in a cadet program now, this paramilitary version of the Boy Scouts. I was in something like that
Hmm.
as a child. In my elementary school and middle school, there were teachers who I remember being pro-Black, who were very present to their own culture and being able to maintain that and strengthen that and lifting up people who were active in the Sojourner Truths and the Harriet Tubmans and the Frederick Douglasses and the Benjamin Bannekers and all of these people. And at the same time, recognizing and acknowledging Puerto Rican independence freedom fighters. So these were things that were just around me, and they're always around. They're in our community today. This is still very much active and present. And so even in the midst of poverty, what people outside see as strictly poverty, there's still a rich level of organizing, of activism, of people just looking out for each other, whether they have a political agenda or not, looking out for kids in the community, and helping meet each other's needs. So that piece has always been present for me. And so that's the piece that I always gravitated to. I would say it's a bit of my mother's inclination to not take anyone's mess, and seeing people who were helping to meet each other's needs in my community, and recognizing the impact that had on me, that I benefited from that, and wanting that for others as well.
You've talked about the influence of Malcolm X and Marcus Garvey on your belief in the power of individual and collective self-determination. So when was first evidence, let's say, that let's say your mother would have been aware of, or your teacher would be aware of, that they had a bit of an action taker, an activist on their hands, someone that wouldn't sit back and just accept the system for what it was?
Oh, for
When
sure.
were those first manifestations?
For sure, high school. The memory instantly when you said that was 1990-ish. At the time, there was a strong anti-apartheid movement, against apartheid in South Africa. And I recall I was very much, myself and my circle of friends, we'd started our own fraternity before we ever even got to college. And we called ourselves the Mountain of Blackness. And Kiambi Roiro was our name. And, I had decided that I wanted for us to really engage and be a part of the anti-apartheid movement and support it. And so I had seen circulating a list of companies that were doing business in South Africa. So there was a call to boycott products that were connected to part of companies that had invested in South Africa. So I got a hold of one of these lists, made bunches of photocopies, and had planned to go out to Fordham Road in the Bronx and hand out these flyers. That day, it was a Saturday, that day, the lock on our door busted. It jammed. For some reason, the door would not open. My mother took it as a sign from God that I was not supposed to go outside, that something would happen. And, keeping in mind, so my mother came from Dominican Republic. She immigrated from Dominican Republic during the time of Trujillo, who was a dictator in Dominican Republic.
What was the name?
Rafael Trujillo, who was
Okay.
a US-backed dictator at the time, and who was killed in the early 1960s, mid 1960s. And so her understanding of protests were that you would get killed. And so when, I was planning to go out and hand out, these flyers. And that's the kind of thing people had been killed for in the past in the Dominican Republic. The door was jammed. She said, "This is a sign from God. Don't go out." I wound up going out the fire escape. We live on the 6th floor. So I went down six stories on the fire escape to go out. So at that point, she already knew, she had a handful. And that, I wasn't going to let a door being jammed stop me from going out and doing what I felt was important.
Today, when we talk about collective action and creating sort of interest groups around injustice, it's easy to do with the internet and the ease of social media and building awareness. But to do something that back then in the 90s, when mainstream media was limited to what you had on sort of the channels on television and the newspapers, getting access to that type of information, I mean, you had to actively sort of seek out and to dig for that type of information. It wasn't easily accessible.
For sure.
Companies doing business in South Africa. So that in itself indicates that you were not just socially aware, but politically aware as well, and of the power that you could have as an individual, and that you actually took it upon yourself to do something like that. It's a big statement.
For sure. Yeah. getting information is the first step, and plugging yourself in to have alternative sources and not rely on mainstream media as your only source, because there are lots of voices that don't get out there, and information that isn't published.
Mm.
So just, yeah, having access to that was key, and then taking action on it was the next step.
What were your early ambitions back then?
Interestingly enough, my ambition by the time I finished high school, it was at the Bronx High School of Science, was actually to do what I'm pretty close to what I'm doing now. It was to be engaged in sustainable development. My intention, I had a previous dream of becoming an astronaut. And so, but I decided to ditch that because I didn't feel comfortable with the pollution coming out of the space shuttle, and or with having to wear a US flag,
Mhm.
and being a poster child for the United States.
Mm.
So both of those things, the latter one being more significant for me at the time.
But
But
if the
both of those,
Dominican Republic had had a space program, it'd be a different story.
well, yeah,
But
for
anyway,
sure.
yeah, yeah.
For sure. I did, but what I came to after that was traveling throughout Africa and Latin
Mm,
America, and supporting, being part of sustainable development projects, and working with people on the ground to really meet local needs in a way that was sustainable, that was ecologically in sync with the ecology, and that
mm.
supported community needs.
What
So,
sparked your
that's
interest in?
pretty much along the lines of where I've been at.
I mean, that's again early proponent or advocate for environmental justice or sustainability back in the 90s. It wasn't really mainstream. I mean, there was obviously growing data of the impact that we were having on the planet, but there wasn't much evidence of people at your age really making a stand and talking about the need for sustainability in the 90s. What was it that built your awareness and consciousness of the need for some form of action?
I wouldn't say it's certainly not the mainstream at this point in time. And I would say at any age, for every generation, as long as society has been engaging in rampant destruction of the environment, anybody who's sensitive to that, and who decides to move and to organize against that and in favor of sustainability, is in a tiny minority. But regardless of that, we still keep moving. That has grown. There's certainly more mainstream consciousness of environmental impacts, but that's as a consequence of the consequences of environmental destruction becoming much bigger. We're seeing the things happening now, the increased power of hurricanes and environmental destruction, the warming weathers, changing seasons. We're seeing those things now that others had been talking about 30 years ago. So, it's just as it becomes more obvious, more people are becoming engaged. For me then, what impacted me and had me aware was, my mother and I were big fans of watching nature shows on television. So public television, PBS always ran the nature series. So I would sit there, in the evenings with my mother, and we'd hear David Attenborough and his British accent talking about lions
Mm.
and cheetahs. And it wasn't until later I started to wonder, well, where are the people in this? But even with that, it had me aware, present to the environment, as something to care about. It was it later on, I became present to the need to integrate the full environment, the full picture, including the urban environment, into that picture of what is the environment and what is it that we need to care about. But that, as far as an early point, that was an entry place for me. It was not too much later on, but it was a bit, somewhat later on, where I became aware of the environmental justice movement that had been growing in the United States, from the South to New York. to California, where people are being community residents were engaged in fights against polluting facilities, whether it's toxic landfills or power plants or chemical companies, where in each of these places the dynamics of racism were very much present. And it's in recognizing that my academic and interest and personal interest in the environment got melded with my passion for racial justice in my communities. And so those two came together in the environmental justice movement.
You went to study at Morehouse College and then laterally at Miami University. How did activism manifest itself during those educational sort of periods?
The connection of, particularly the connection of the environment, the cooperatives, self-determination as a concept really came together for me during those years when I was in college, not in the academic setting, but outside of the university, where I started at Morehouse College in 1991. That very spring, Rodney King uprising really took off. And for those who don't know, Rodney King was our equivalent of George Floyd. He was the first person black man who's beating by police was actually caught on videotape. They had tape then, not phones. And it really set off, a movement. The trial and the acquittal of the police that engaged in that beating really, it touched a nerve all across the country, and it led to uprisings from that moment for me on the campus of the Atlanta University Center, which was Morehouse College, Spelman College, Clark Atlanta University, Morris Brown College, all of them together. That really became a spark, a galvanizing point. And so it brought many students together across the campuses to form an organization that became known as Students for African American Empowerment. And we organized, and we were involved in protests against the Confederate battle flag on the Georgia state flag. Actually burned the battle flag off of the state flag several times. And today it's no longer there. It was removed some years later. But these and many other actions were ones that we engaged in. I became very focused on issues of economics, and so that became an important place for me to really focus in on what were the things that could really impact our communities, that could really impact the daily life, the meeting the needs of people in our community, Black people, and really creating the space for that. And so that is when I really started to think about cooperatives as a place for organizing. Cooperatives, having institutions, businesses that are owned and controlled by their members, whether they're shoppers at a supermarket or workers who are otherwise employees at any business, or where there are people coming together as producers to get their needs met, to lower costs, to really be able to get their product and empower people themselves to really own and control their own enterprises. So the Federation of Southern Cooperatives was one that I had heard of. So that was they're like the godparents of Black cooperatives. These were people who really were important in the movement. And I saw as really a place that people who reflected me and reflected others around me in taking this idea of cooperative enterprises and really putting it into practice right there in the community. In this case, in the South. And so that was an important example for me at the time, and that has just grown over the years.
And you had that light bulb moment that I heard you talk about in 2003, when you were back in the South Bronx, to when you began focusing on not just cooperatives, but growing green businesses. Can you describe that?
Yeah, so I'd put cooperatives to the side to really focus in on environmental justice issues. I came back to New York City, began working with the New York City Environmental Justice Alliance, and was really engaged in supporting community organizing on the ground, fighting polluters. And within that, there was always the question that people would ask, well, if not these dirty polluters, then what? What are you offering? They're promising jobs. Even though the jobs didn't actually materialize, they were promising jobs. And so it became clear that alternatives needed to be created that could actually meet needs. And so I and others became involved in searching for those green businesses, those green alternatives. Basically, I was looking for benevolent green capitalists that would, parachute out of the sky, wanting to operate in the South Bronx or in Brooklyn and other places, and was having, surprisingly, a really hard time finding any. So after a point, it became frustrating. And throughout it was frustrating because I was also never particularly comfortable with the approach of just looking for some benevolent capitalists, but really began then to ask myself, well, if not this, then what? What would an ideal business be? What would a business look like that I would feel comfortable with, that would be a good neighbor just by its structure, not because of the whims of a founder who would eventually leave, but is actually the structure of the business made it so that it became a good neighbor, that was good to its workers and good to the surrounding community. And that clicked for me in that moment. What could do that was actually the cooperative business structure, particularly worker cooperatives as far as being good neighbors, but cooperatives generally. That these are businesses that are owned and controlled by their members, and their members are from the community. And so to the extent that members are from the community, then the operations of that business are going to be one that meets community needs broadly, because nobody wants to gas their own neighbor and they don't want to gas their neighborhood. So you put things in place that are actually able to ensure that your community doesn't wind up being getting the raw end of the deal, that doesn't wind up being a dumping ground for polluting industries. I had seen too many instances and fought against too many companies that had overseas headquarters or out of state headquarters, CEOs and management and employees in some cases who did not live in the community that they were operating in, particularly at the upper management level. But there was always a recognition, if the smokestack actually pointed to your boardroom, you would be making very different decisions. And so to bring an ecological reference in, we talk about negative feedback loops. A negative feedback loop is an action that results in a negative impact that winds up coming back to you. And that in turn, since you're feeling the impact, then you change you have sense, you're going to change your next action. So, having businesses that have these built-in negative feedback loops that say, okay, we won't pollute because if we do, it's going to immediately hurt our interests. That's the kind of structural change that needs to happen. But that's not how our economic system operates. We have businesses that don't feel the impacts of their actions. Impacts are external. The costs are all externalized. Whenever there's an impact on a worker's health or safety, on a community's health or safety, those impacts they're offloaded. The company doesn't have to pay for those in any kind of way. So if we look at how to actually structure a business that does, then we have to look at, who are the owners, who are the workers, who are the people that have to bear the direct cost of that have to feel the direct impact of that decision to pollute, that decision to say to workers, we're not going to invest in protective equipment. We're going to put the burden on you to protect your own self, your own health and safety. It's a very different kind of circumstance. I'd visited a worker-owned factory in the Mondragon region in Spain. And something I share often with people is I was blown away by one instance where I'm walking through the plant and there are these huge silos within the middle of the factory floor that in any other plant in the US would have been extremely loud to the point of being deafening. But in this particular plant, it was actually dead quiet. And what was brought to my attention and to the attention of others is that the reason why it was dead quiet was because the workers in the plant made the decision that instead of putting the burden on themselves, on individual workers to wear protective ear equipment, that they would actually just cover the source of the noise, being the silos themselves, and just covered them completely. And so that puts the burden, then it puts the cost on the company as a whole to protect its workers, as opposed to the individual workers themselves to protect their own hearing. That's a huge difference. And that's what it looks like when you make a structural change that has deeper and deeper impacts.
It's funny when there aren't any, not that I'm aware of anyway, any venture capitalists exist to help grow and nurture cooperative based businesses. Maybe that is something that needs to manifest to actually sort of accelerate sort of the changes that you're talking about.
By and large, you're right. There are not venture capitalists that are beating down the doors to invest in cooperative enterprises or worker-owned enterprises. They don't see them as being able to generate the high rates of return that they're looking for. And because they're not set up for that. They're set up to meet the needs of their members and generating a return for their members. But I will say there is a growing movement of people who are engaging and are really developing a field called non-extractive finance that are out
Interesting.
to really create vehicles and channels for those with wealth to invest in cooperatives and cooperative development. And so there are great organizations like the Seed Commons Cooperative, which is operates across the US. And these are a network, a cooperative of local cooperative development lenders who
What's
invest
it
in
called?
cooperatives. So they're called Seed Commons. And
Ah,
so it's a great network, a great cooperative of all of these different local lenders. And all they pool their money together so that they're able to make bigger deals. And they offer financing to cooperative enterprises with terms that aren't what are called extractive. They're, you get a loan from a bank and the payment is due the very next month. And regardless of whether you actually have broken even or not, you have the ability to pay. In their case, with the whole concept of non-extractive financing is you're out to support the growth and development of the enterprises themselves. And so you want to get them to a place where they at least they've broken even and they're starting to generate a return. And that takes time. So it's patient capital in that sense. So, there's a growing movement of that. But there's needs to be a recognition that it has to operate outside of the terms that have driven capitalist finance. And so if you look at the field of finance, this is where wealth has been generated, and most of it is artificial. You have people that are getting wealthy off of trading, off of just trading, you know, things that are symbols of wealth and symbols of businesses. So, we need something different and something that really supports the growth of of what we call the solidarity economy, and which is really an economy that is centering people meeting each other's needs and supporting each other.
I think maybe we need to rephrase and redefine what a rate of return is. It's not in terms of the return on 10x on their capital investment,
Right.
but it's the return in a broader sense.
The return on human relationships, it's a return on human capacity, social networks, it's a return on environmental sustainability. So it's a return on all of these things, but those things aren't counted. They're not counted, in the, when you do your tax returns. They're not
True.
counted, they're not kind of counted towards financial benchmarks. What is counted and what typical investors are looking at are the financial rates of return. So, thank you for highlighting that. But we do need to move towards other measures, other benchmarks that include sustainability, that include our own human relationships.
Well, this is probably a good point for you to then talk about what you're working to achieve before you shuffle off this mortal coil. You've created something called the Collective Diaspora. and you are having impact. You are creating rates of return that are beyond just the financial benchmarks and changing people's lives, not just in New York and the South Bronx, but increasingly internationally. So could you maybe just start to describe?
So, it's having an impact broadly is certainly our goal and our intention. I had been over the years, had many people have reached out to me who were looking for support and in their work. And but there wasn't a way for a vehicle for that, because when you're engaged in local organizing in your community, there's not a whole lot of bandwidth to really be building solidarity and exchanging information with other groups in other places. And so but it's important, it's necessary having those spaces where we exchange information. That's about movement building. And movement building is critical in order to sustain the growth of, even on the local level, because the work that happens on the local level is directly connected to solidarity with other communities in other places. And that's essential. Taking it back to when I was a high school student, what I was doing as a young person, supporting an anti-apartheid struggle in South Africa, would not have happened without people in New York City who were collecting information about companies that were doing business in South Africa, who were in communication with people fighting apartheid directly in South Africa, and with community-based organizations that were engaged in their own struggle, Black organizations who were engaged in their own struggle for self-determination, for community control of resources in Brooklyn or the Bronx or Harlem, who saw a connection with their brothers and sisters and siblings in South Africa, and being able to come together to exchange information and resources. That's what strengthens movements in both places. So that's what we're looking to do. What we want is, we want to support the growth of this global Black solidarity economy. There's a solidarity economy and movement all across the world where people are engaged in cooperatives and mutual aid projects, and really coming together with other mechanisms for measuring growth and development, and whether, even to public banking. So these are all things that are under this umbrella of a solidarity economy. But in order to have a solidarity economy that is powerful, that's strong, that's coming from the bottom up, then there have to be these strong networks. And in our case, what we're really focusing on is ensuring that racial justice, that gender justice are at the center of that, and that the needs of Black communities that are racial minorities in countries like the US, or are in countries that are predominantly Black, but are still struggling under the yoke of neocolonialism in the Caribbean, in Central South America, or on the African continent, that all of us are able to come together and support each other's needs, so that we're not reliant on wealthier white communities just hoping for, what's left over from
or
liberal
or investors.
that are still dealing with their own racial baggage. So, we want to make sure that we're supporting each other in our own growth and development.
As you're talking about that, where you're not reliant on traditional sort of white, as you say, neo-colonial structures, just from a practical sort of standpoint, if let's say a group of individuals come together in, let's say, New York, and want to create a cooperative-based business, what's the difference in terms of how would they go about creating that structure? Is there a framework for what a cooperative is? I mean, I'm familiar with cooperatives because I grew up in the UK, and the cooperative movement began with something called the Rochdale Pioneers in 1844 and became a £35 billion sector in the UK. But it's not, people aren't as familiar with cooperatives, I think, in the US. So could you maybe just explain, if a group of people did want to come together to create a cooperative-led or a cooperative-based business, how do they go about the financing for it? What's the process of a formation of a company? Is it an LLC? Is it a non-LLC? Is there another structure?
Okay, so there are a few different avenues or a few different balls that one is juggling when you're launching a cooperative. So if anyone listening wants to launch a cooperative of their own, there are a few things you need to be mindful of. So first, what the country that you're in, or the state, if you're in the United States, the state that you're in has its own laws that impact how you are actually going to formally structure, if you choose to formally structure your cooperative enterprise. And so certainly having legal support that guides you through that process is key. So I would recommend first, or anyone engaging in this, to really find people who can support them. So there's legal support, there's support in the work that needs to happen just related to your governance structures, how you choose to operate. A cooperative is still a business. It's important and it's critical that you really be clear on your business model, how you're actually going to be able to provide the resources that you want to provide, whether you're installing solar panels or whether you're running a mining operation, or you're running some artisanal jewelry operation, or consulting. Whatever it is that you're doing, you need to be clear on what you're offering your customers, how you're meeting their needs. What are the resources that you require, who are your key partners, your activities, the channels that you're using to get product A to customer A. And all of those things are things that you need to work out, whether you're a traditional capitalist business or whether you're a cooperative. That's something you want to be really clear on. Beyond that, though, and what distinguishes a cooperative is your governance structure, who owns and controls, and being clear on that and having the conversations amongst each other. I mean, you can have those conversations yourselves. Certainly getting support from others who've been down that road helps. So there are a number of networks globally, that people can tap into. For folks in the United States, there's the National Cooperative Business Association, as an all-encompassing, their trade organization of cooperatives of many different types. In the worker cooperative sector, there's the U.S. Federation of Worker Cooperatives. In Europe, there are, a number for every, many countries in Europe. In Africa, there's a new entity called Cooperation Africa. In the Caribbean, Central South America, there are different sectors for different each country. Collective Diaspora is working across borders, and so we are serving to connect people to resources and each other, cooperatives to each other in different countries. And so, being a repository for information across borders is something that we're working to develop. I wish we had that right now on our site, but we don't. But that is in development. So
that's exciting, because that's definitely what's going to be needed for people to come together, find that resource to feed off each other's experience and knowledge, and to have those resources to accelerate the growth of this type of structure.
Just having the information is the first step, because it's not something that's taught. It's not taught in most places.
It's in business school. No.
Yeah. It's not the typical way of starting businesses. So it's not talked about, not only in business schools, but even just in popular discourse, on television, or, on in social media. It's not the way things are.
You wouldn't see it, someone pitching it in Shark Tank.
No, you would get lots of strange looks. Yeah. Lots of strange looks and bizarre questions.
So you're a fellow of something called Echoing Green.
Yes. That's right.
Could you just describe what that is in New York and the impact that's had on you?
Well, the Echoing Green Fellowship is awarded every year to change makers around the world, actually. And so I received an Echoing Green Fellowship this past year, so less than a year ago. So I'm still in that year of the fellowship, and so it's been a great resource. Certainly, it's provided some initial funding to be able to launch Collective Diaspora. And so it's allowed me the space to be able to engage in this work, coordinate activities for our steering committee. We're a 14-person steering committee, and that's building this out. and really building out the infrastructure that we need in order to launch this. We have many big aspirations. Some of the initial ones that what we're currently working on is really mapping out the global Black solidarity economy, and building out a platform that allows a crowdsourced platform that allows people to identify Black cooperatives in their own country, in their own place, so that would be a first place, a starting point to be able to identify where these cooperatives are and where the organizations are that support them, because that's a key piece. We are often too often we're operating under the radar without resources, whether it's the cooperatives or the community-based organizations that are supporting them, that are themselves struggling for capital to be able to do this work, because the communities that we're operating in are marginalized communities. And so it's critical that we be able to uplift the work of each of these organizations and the cooperatives, so that people can know about them and support them and say, I want to buy my chocolate from these Black producers in their countries that are directly benefiting, that are, the wealth that's being generated is staying with them in their communities, with the workers and the growers. So I want to buy from the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective as opposed to Nestle. But you wouldn't, if you didn't know that Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective exists, then you would never find them, because Nestle you see everywhere. So Nestle or Godiva or any of the other. So it's important that we have platforms that really uplift and center these alternatives, so that these alternatives can become mainstream.
It was a book I read earlier this year or late last year, and the name is What We Owe the Future by Douglas McCaskill. And McCaskill believes in the effect of altruism, and he had this line at the end of the book that really hit me and made me sort of question my own sort of actions and life direction. And he said, if not you, then who? And if not now, then when? And as you sort of described the sort of the journey you've been on, it's very much that is you, if not you, then who? You have taken these actions. But it's also one that's broader than the individual. It's almost like a collective call to people to form, to say, you don't have to go down the traditional path. And the reason I mention it is another book that's had an impact on me is by a guy called John Alexander, who's written a book called Citizens. And he argues that the issue we've got with our broken system is it's a consumer-led story that we've been conditioned to believe in. And we have to move away from that consumer-led story to a citizen story. He said, because that's what we ultimately are. It's a more natural condition and story. And he said, we're in this process, this liminal sort of phase where we're moving away from the consumer story. And we have to, because everything around it is broken. And the way he talks about in the book, the citizen story and the movement he's set up in the UK and will increasingly move international, is very aligned with the type of solution that you're building through cooperatives. And it's the same question. People go, well, it's all very well saying the consumer story is broken, but give us a solution. And I think that's what people are looking for, are alternatives to the fractured system that we've been living under, and these traditional sort of business, hierarchical, top-down, white-led, as you say, neo-colonialism, sort of throwback to the old industrial age. As we're moving forward to a new age, we need new systems. And your, let's say, collective-led, cooperative-powered movement is more natural to the way that communities used to operate in a pre-industrial age. It is more natural. It is more citizen-led. So it feels very empowering. And although you are focused very much on these marginalized communities, Black and Latin communities in like New York and increasingly in the Caribbean and beyond, it is something that's going to appeal to other communities, not just Black and Latin, people that feel they've been economically exploited by the 0.1% of the 1% and been left behind. Because I just look at when I'm back in Britain, and you can see the impact on communities that have been left behind if you go outside of London, and the devastating impact of exploitation. And the same way that in the 1800s that the Rochdale pioneers created the British cooperative movement, maybe what you're doing is you're the spark that through Collective Diaspora ignite a new movement of cooperatives. And what you're doing is you're just setting the framework and, as you say, creating this directory, this resource where people can learn from each other. And if we are going to create a more sustainable, solidarity-driven economy that isn't based on traditional sort of capitalist structures, it needs to be embraced by all communities.
So, something to be present to is that
Yes.
my outlook is that there is no new spark, or there isn't, a spark of a new movement. There has always been, as you mentioned earlier, there's been a way of operating, a way of managing and distributing resources that people have been doing collectively since we've been living together in human societies. The way we have been distributing resources has changed over time. We've gone through different stages, from feudalism to mercantilism into capitalism. And so the push towards industrialization has been very much, a part and product of capitalism and this shift. And that has introduced a way of operating, a way of, setting up enterprises that have this employer-employee relationship that really has driven this. I see the counter to that, we've been calling the solidarity economy. This is something that has been in place for a long time. And, the cooperatives, within that, mutual aid societies, rotating savings and credit associations, things that people are doing to meet each other's needs have been a part of that and are always a part of that. The work that we're doing at Collective Diaspora is to strengthen a piece of that, to strengthen that within marginalized Black communities that have borne the brunt of capitalism's effects since the dawn of the transatlantic slave trade, which was right there and nurtured the growth of capitalism. It was, both things were happening at the same time. And so, and that sense of history is often absent from how we think of economic development. But so this is something that our view is that without a strong focus directly on the communities that have been marginalized, where the communities themselves are able and have a place to be able to develop the resources and to really focus in, then no one else is going to be able to move any further. You can't be free if anyone in your community is not free, because the impacts are going to be felt by everyone. So there's been, since you referred to the Rochdale pioneers of England, their development, the development of predominantly white cooperatives, these predominantly white cooperatives have long existed. So their growth and development will continue. But without the growth and development of cooperatives in the communities that have been exploited, then we can't have a shift away from capitalism and it's the worst of it, and into a different kind of economy. We can't evolve into something else. I've used a reference before related to the environment, where you have communities that have been used as dumping grounds. There's a kettle or a pressure cookers. Pressure cookers or crock pots have these steam release valves.
Yeah.
And those steam release valves allow for, once the pressure builds up in the system, for the steam to escape. Without those steam release valves, what you have is a pipe bomb. And so Black communities around the world have been that steam release valve. And so as long as it has been the presence of these communities, indigenous communities around, in the Western Hemisphere, have been that steam release valve. And it is our communities that have been the dumping grounds for waste, that have been the places to site factories that contaminate and pollute. These are the places where the worst of corporate abuses are practiced on workers that come from these communities, come from our communities. And so as long as our communities are allowed to remain these release valves, then the worst of capitalist development will still exist and will still be present. So for the sake of white cooperators looking to create alternatives, it is critical that black communities have strong cooperative movements, that the alternatives that are focused on communities that have been the most marginalized. So that's how I see things. In order to really have to push all of society towards an alternative, towards a different way of structuring our economy, then the most marginalized really have to be centered and focused on, because that's where the weakest links are, where the chain has been broken, where the excesses of society, the market failures are operating and in place. We would not have a climate disaster happening presently. We would not be talking about global climate change or the melting of polar ice caps if those communities, if Louisiana didn't have a cancer alley where you have Black communities that are these hotbeds of of oil refineries and chemical plants that have been polluting for so long, for decades upon decades. So it's these places these are where the smokestacks are that emit the pollution, that go into the atmosphere, that trap the gases that are heating the planet. So those are the places where our focus and efforts have to be.
That's brilliant. That's really clear to address the exploitative and extractive impact that these businesses have had on these communities. You're right. It has to change, but it's probably it's slow. There needs to be more awareness of what you're
Sure.
talking about than there is at the moment. But what done brilliantly there is you've pieced together the fact that it's not just about environment. You can't look at that independently without thinking about it in terms of the exploitative nature of the way that our economy has been on these communities of color.
Absolutely.
And whether it be indigenous sort of people or even within the sort of the US or in my country in the UK, the reimagining of business starts at a community level. So what you're doing is incredibly important. I mean, with Collective Diaspora, I mean, you've been on this journey for a while. You've got this echoing green fellowship. You've got a long way to go, but you're obviously sort of a very driven individual. What's your ambition for a key date like 2030 that's been set by the UN Sustainable Development Goals for hitting certain climate targets? You must have your own ambitions of where you want to be by 2030 and beyond.
I tend to have lofty ambitions that time frame comes and you wind up having to push those back. So with that,
I will say, recently interviewed a coach called Barbara Douse, and she talked about having big, hairy, audacious goals. But underneath those big, hairy, audacious goals, having SMART goals that are your steps to get there.
yes, that is critical. I'm learning to get better at that, for sure. For Collective Diaspora, our goal, our intention is that we are able to connect Black cooperatives and Black-led organizations supporting cooperative development with each other across borders. And that, what I see in 7 years, because we're in 2023, so 2030 is just 7 years away, that we have deepened relationships. We have connected people and organizations that weren't connected before. We've deepened relationships. We've put cooperatives and organizations on the map with others around the world, and we facilitated opportunities for trade between them so that there is a greater sense of solidarity, of Pan-African Black solidarity across borders that is leaving local movements stronger, in stronger positions, so that we have groups that are in Colombia, in Trinidad, that are in much stronger positions and are able to advocate for themselves with the full knowledge and support of their brothers and sisters and siblings that are organizing to similar effect and with similar circumstances in other countries as well. So, what we're out is to build a strong movement of organizations, and we have a strong member-led cooperative that operates across borders and is raising the profile for Black cooperatives across the board.
How do you get funding?
I'm still trying to figure that out.
No, the reason
Operating right now with a fellowship from Echoing Green. And
Mhm.
so a big piece of my job now is really beating the bushes and finding the support, institutional, individual donors. So we are certainly looking for support. So if anyone out there looking to donate, please do. You can reach us, Collective Diaspora. We are on all the socials and online. And yeah, what we're looking for is to really build out that base of support that unfortunately hasn't been there. It's difficult for cooperatives, for those who are developing cooperatives, and it's especially difficult for people of color who are Black and Indigenous in particular, that are organizing for the development of cooperatives.
You're essentially an accelerator for cooperative startups. And because if you think about likes of Y Combinator, they all learn from each other, these businesses. They all benefit from the mistakes, the learnings as it becomes a process of emergence. And you're at that early phase. So in a sense, anyone that's investing and supporting you is helping accelerate the growth of new economic model that
Absolutely.
will benefit both the planet and the people and these exploited communities that have borne the brunt of the extractive sort of traditional economic model. So there are organizations. I mean, I think it makes me think as you're talking of someone like, you're familiar with Acumen?
No.
Jacqueline Novokratz's organization.
Okay.
She's great. I went to an event of Jacqueline's and Acumen back in 2019 before the pandemic, and she invests in a lot of indigenous sort of based businesses in Africa and in Colombia. And a reason when you're talking about the chocolate, I met the founder who came from Colombia of a chocolate brand that she supports. And it's very much in the model. I don't know if they're a cooperative, but it was a really interesting business.
Great to know.
So I would reach out to Jacqueline if I were you and the Acumen movement.
Well, connect us, please.
Well, the problem is I've been trying to get to Jacqueline for a long time. She's one step away from me in my connections, but I will do. But I think my role is, in what I'm doing with the podcast, is to start to connect other difference makers and change makers and people that want to see a better alternative, but might not be aware of people doing important work that is aligned with their interests. So anything I can do to connect you to some of my other guests where there might be some benefit from you coming together is what I'm trying to do with these what I'm calling random collisions.
Yeah.
So engineering random collisions.
It's always appreciated. It is, I had previously, when I was doing this work locally in New York City, being able to secure funding, for the work, for supporting cooperative development, particularly in a low-income community of color, was always a challenge and always difficult. There was the hurdle already of cooperatives and really people seeing the value of that as an alternative. And then on top of that, there's the skepticism that people of color, particularly Black people, are able to start businesses, that it's a safer bet to engage in workforce development strategies, to train people for jobs. But I know, many people who have been engaged in workforce development strategies, that they run into this challenge of, you train people for work, but where do they go? Where's the work for them when the businesses aren't hiring, when the people that they send who are qualified go for jobs and they're passed over? And they're passed over, they're looked over, partly because they are Black. They're coming from a low income community. They're seen as people with very little skill, even though they would have come from, a training program and are skilled, but there's still bias that's out there. But even on top of that, there's still the fact of, the employers have to be out there. And so what I've seen and always get excited about is when we have people that are come together because they said, we tried going the route of getting work and people wouldn't hire us. So we decided to come together and hire ourselves. It's with Solar Uptown Now Services. They're solar installers in Harlem. They went through a workforce training program run by West Harlem Environmental Action to train people on solar and to be solar panel installers because they saw this as a, pathway into a green economy and creating work for people. But then they trained workers and the workers went out and they couldn't get jobs. They had the skill. They would go to potential employers who would pass them over for people in their own social circles. So have
Uh,
predominantly white business owners. They're going to be hiring predominantly white employees because that's who's in their social circle. You hire first from the people that people that you trust. So if you're outside of that, then you're really out of the loop. So there are lots of hurdles that people have to overcome. Black people in particular have to overcome in order to create pathways for ourselves.
if someone hears this and goes, this is exactly what I want to do, how would they go about starting a cooperative and becoming part of your collective diaspora?
So first step for anyone who wants to connect with Collective Diaspora is to find us online. So we're at diaspora.coop. That's actually it's a new domain. We're just transitioning our website from collectivediaspora.org to diaspora.coop. So go to diaspora.coop. We are on social media, so Instagram, it's Collective Diaspora, and get in touch with us. We can connect any aspiring Black cooperative or co-op development organization that is looking to connect with others. We will do that work and connect you with wherever you are and bring you into the network. We are taking on new members, so people can go to our site to join up either as a cooperative or as an organization that is supporting that work, and also affiliates. So we're particularly looking for, we want to uplift and connect Black technical assistance providers. So people who are not necessarily part of an organization, but they are, maybe you're within a law firm or you're operating out of some predominantly white institution, but you want to have that network of Black technical assistance providers and be connected to Black co-ops, Black cooperatives. So there's a space for that as well. So
Cool.
so you can find us online.
Mhm. Anyone that's going through building a business and creating change face barriers, face resistance to old, but particularly when it's such an ingrained system. You are really trying to create something that's radically, not as you say, cooperatives have been around for an eternity, but you're trying to overcome a traditional entrenched system. How do you remain sort of resolute and resilient when the journey at times must be hard?
Hmm. Well, I find joy in the moments when I see people coming together and enjoying each other. And within cooperatives, it's seeing people who are forming cooperatives for the first time and seeing the immediate benefits. They've started work. They went through the challenge of figuring out how to work together without killing each other and getting to that place. And that is powerful. And seeing that happen is powerful. Then they're actually working together and they start to see the returns. You completed a job. Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective that I mentioned earlier. We connected them with cooperators in the US, and they were connected to Equal Exchange. And so Equal Exchange just they got put in a huge order. So they completed 18,000, produced 18,000 bars of chocolate and that are now available through Equal Exchange. So if anyone's listening who wants some chocolate from Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective, go to Equal Exchange and you can buy it through their platform. But having those kinds of wins brings me joy, and that's what brings me satisfaction. You can see, little lights at the end of tunnels that get you a little further. As long as there's not an oncoming train, then
Yeah. What would you describe as your natural gifts or talents?
I have a talent for being persistent.
Clearly.
I have a talent for setting big visions and moving forward on those and being persistent around those. I'd say I've been good at really lifting up those around me, which is what calls me to this being this role of a connector and network builder. So really playing that role, that's something that I have a gift for, and that is a part of what Collective Diaspora is about and what I'm excited about in Collective Diaspora. It's really lifting up the work of those around me and and really being able to help put things in place so that everyone's able to get their needs met.
Mhm. And what do people compliment you for?
Being patient, being patient,
Patience and
um,
persistence are two great
kind of go
characteristics.
together. Yeah, being patient, being calm, just being reflective on
Mhm.
occasion. My wife says I'm not reflective enough, but being reflective.
Obviously, anyone that within the communities that you're talking about wants to create a cooperative, they know where to go. But what about people that might be in, let's say, white communities that want to help and take action? What would you recommend people do to help address, however small, just some of the injustices that still remain, whether it be social injustice, environmental injustice? I think there's a collective awareness of increasing injustice exists at all parts of society. And I think there's a yearning people have to do something about it, but often feel helpless in the face of what seems to be insurmountable challenges,
Mhm.
particularly around the environment. But you know from the journey you've been on that change doesn't happen overnight. It can be a result of small actions
Mhm.
that you have to take to get you to your destination. And it is all about the journey. So, what would your advice be to people that may want to take action but maybe aren't? What should they do?
Well, you asked specifically about people who are white.
I think so
I'd
because
say,
I mean you're creating an
Mhm.
opportunity definitely to help black communities and marginalized communities and communities that have been exploited. But for those people that might be, there's a lot of people in my social networks. What
Yeah.
could they do?
So I think that there are two things in particular that I think are essential for anyone who is white, and I say that regardless of the country that they're in. That is one, uplifting or centering the leadership of those who are most marginalized. In particular, in terms of racial justice, talking about Black and Indigenous people, wherever they are, uplifting their leadership and experience. So that means that if you are engaging in some kind of policy effort, fundraising, funding effort, some initiative that is attempting to address the social needs, that you recognize that you are not the ultimate expert, that your experience and what you think is appropriate should not be driving the discussion. What should be driving the discussion are the needs of those who are actually being directly impacted on the ground. So that's one, is center the leadership of those that are most marginalized. The other is recognizing your own privileges. And by that, I mean the things that got you to the position where you currently find yourself in this opportunity, having this opportunity to make decisions for other people. 'Cause we all can make a choice at any given moment. If I am in a circle of people and I'm being asked, what do I think should be done for some other group that is not a group that I belong to? I can make a choice to either go along with it and give my suggestion, or trying to turn the tables and uplift someone else's leadership. But that requires that I be reflective on what got me to that place in the first place. If it's my own financial backing, in my case, I'm a cisgender male. I own a home. I've gone to not just undergraduate, but graduate school. So there's a class difference between me and most of my neighbors. that's something that I have to be present to. I'm engaging in work that is across borders, but I was born and raised in the United States. Even though my family is from the Dominican Republic and I am Black and identify as Black, and I've grown up that way in the United States, I still have a US passport. So I can go to places without being stopped at immigration, I can go to places without having to wait for years for a visa. I can get preferred treatment in another country because people will see me as being from the US and privileges that come with that. So those are things that I have to be present to just in our own conversations around how we build this international cross-border alliance, because everyone is not coming from that kind of a place. So those are things that, to be reflective of your own social position, whether we're talking right now, you asked related to race, but it's across the board: race, gender, class, sexuality, all the different manifestations, nationality, all of those things. So those two things,
Okay.
uplifting the leadership of those most marginalized and being reflective of your own social position or your own privilege.
Well, I'm really look forward to witnessing the growing impact that you're going to have with Collective Diaspora. I think it's only going to scale and grow and become more of the mainstream as we transition away from our old extraction sort of driven economic structures and exploitative organizational structures to something that's more based on justice for all. So anything that I can do to engineer serendipitous connections and random collisions, we'll definitely be doing that over the next few weeks as we get this live. So, and if there's anyone that you see within the network that you want to connect with, then just shout and we'll connect you. And that leads me to the last question, which is, who do we interview next?
There are many people that I can think of, there are a few, many people, if you got a list, I can make it for you. One that I've mentioned some. So Jillian Goddard at the Cross Atlantic Chocolate Collective. She is a co-founder of the collective and has been a lead facilitator of that growing co-op. And so they are, cross-border as well, covering 6 or 8 different countries on the African continent, in the Caribbean, and in the US, and has been doing amazing work. Dr. Caroline Shanaz Hossein out of the University of Toronto has really been doing really important work uplifting rotating savings and credit associations and the economic tools that of Black women across the diaspora that really are, alternatives to how extractive financing works. So, these
That
are,
would be really interesting.
yeah,
Yeah.
no, she's been doing great work and has been key in helping form a council of Black women who are organizers of these rotating savings credit associations. So those are two in particular that I think you should definitely have on your show.
Well, let's start with those two. The other person as well that springs to mind that you should talk to is Yvonne Moore. She runs Moore Philanthropy. I like Yvonne. She's doing great work as well.
Great.
Excellent. I've enjoyed the conversation. I just think all these new structures, new communities, collectives, it is the future. So I think it's exciting to be part of that journey. So I just wish you all the best of luck.
Thank you.
And let's just make this the beginning of the conversation, not the end.
Yes. Yeah. I
Cool.
appreciate you inviting me to be on the show and us having this conversation. So it's been
Great. Okay, that's all for now, folks. Now here's my ask of you. Please follow this podcast on Apple or Spotify or whatever player you use. Also, please subscribe to our new Random Collisions newsletter. We really are working to build a global community of action takers, action engines of people that really care about the problems that need solving. Thank you very much, and see you next time.